Natsuki Subaru is constantly bashed online by viewers for his stupid decisions at times. Some people even going as far as to think of him as an incompetent protagonist who cannot do anything at all and has to rely on the plot saving him, which is anything but the case for anyone who even has the most basic of media literacy. But that aside, is Subaru really that dumb? It's honestly become a frequent pattern for people to complain about how Subaru is really dumb when that isn't the case at all. I would even go as far as to say that it might be at the opposite spectrum entirely, to the point that I think whether he is a genius or not is something we should question. It's gotten to a point where some people are stupid enough to think they'd actually do better than Subaru in his situation, and talk about how they'd absolutely destroy the competition if they had his ability. Since this is similar in vein to a video I've already created in the past on why I think Subaru is actually far stronger than you'd ever imagine, I recommend watching it when this video is finished. Subaru's refusal to use his authority immediately upon any slight misfortune is also not something stupid, as I've seen some people claim, but just something any sane person would do, as there's not a single person who would like to commit suicide all the time, or turn out like Kasaneru Subaru. Subaru himself isn't very academically smart because he wasn't really interested in school after a certain point, to the point he stopped caring for his grades entirely and his eventual hikomori status. But he's actually fairly knowledgeable for his age in his interests such as astronomy and history, being an avid reader of books of the past during his status as a shut-in. Subaru in the source material has always been a bit sharper than his anime counterpart, with him even in Arc 2 figuring out the situation and judging Roswaal as suspicious, knowing that both Ram and Rem were given orders to constantly keep Subaru under their observation to know everything he does. Moving to the first loop of Arc 3. When Rem and Subaru first encounter a white whale, the carriage they are on is completely destroyed, and at the very same time this is happening, the entire carriage is destroyed into just purely sticks as he loses his phone and it falls in the opposite direction. And somehow, Subaru was then able to perceive the time on his Nokia-like phone in the pitch of the night, with it being made more difficult by the mist as well as the dust around him, and then somehow kept this irrelevant information in his head after all of the horrible loops he went through, including a loop where he was completely insane for multiple days, to then use against as a crux against Kush. This speaks of Subaru's absolutely insane observation ability, as well as his ability to keep even the most random things in his memory for later, despite them being irrelevant at that time, keeping something as random as his phone's battery percentage in his mind even far later on. Unlike in the anime, where Subaru is just easily given the favor of Anastasia, Kush, and Russell, in the light novel, he has to think of a complete plan to somehow convince all of them to give him the opportunity to gather their favor. With little to no time to prepare and think of a strategy, Subaru managed to sway both Anastasia and Russell into participating in the negotiations with Kush by tricking them and presenting their situation as favorable. The presence of these two would also become something crucial due to Kush's ability to see through people. Some of you may wonder why I said Kush's ability to see through people rather than simply referring it to as the divine protection of wind reading. That is because Subaru, when engineering his plan, was not aware that Kush possessed a divine protection. He dealt with the problem as if he was dealing with someone of unparalleled insight, not someone with a blessing from the world. The beginning of Subaru's plan was to prove that his phone is something like a meteor, which informs about the witch beast posing a threat to its user. This way, he could explain his knowledge of the exact time and place of white whale's nearing appearance without elaborating on what the cell phone is. However, to avoid being seen through, Subaru, instead of outright lying about his phone, fabricated the truth by carefully guiding Kush's thought process. As we see later, Subaru set the alarm for 3:30 PM and proclaimed that the device does inform about White Whale's appearance. Kush didn't detect any lie because the phone would ring the moment White Whale appeared, essentially informing everyone on the battlefield of its appearance and therefore technically not being a lie, just a good grasp on the words he said. Although he was confident in his acting skills, he was also aware that fooling Kush's insight wouldn't be that easy. That is why he didn't allow any situation where his facial muscles or demeanor, which he was not conscious about, could be read by her, which resulted in Subaru persuading Kush to believe his bluff and secured another ally for the upcoming battle, making room for his goal of subjugating Sloth later. Even though it may already sound impressive, that is not everything. As revealed later in the story, Kush's divine protection not only allows her to merely detect lies, but also to be able to read someone's intentions and emotions with great depth. Furthermore, her divine protection was stated to possess the ability to read literal thoughts and intentions of people around her, Additionally, in the first X volume, Kush was also stated to be able to perceive the true state of people's heart through the divine protection of wind reading, meaning she is not limited to reading superficial emotions and is impossible to deceive her by any conventional acting. With that said, to actually fool Kush during the negotiations, Subaru had to instead control his emotions and incorporate this into his acting so precisely that even her divine protection wouldn't be able to notice any attempt to fool her. Concluding, in the initial part of his strategy, Subaru fooled Roswaal, Anastasia, and Kush with his deceit, which also meant foreseeing everyone's response and reactions to the foreign device, such as his cell phone and how their interests would clash in giving him room for negotiations that would lead him to getting their favor. Despite not being present himself, Subaru also managed to bait Anastasia during negotiations. He sent Rem to her with the precise instructions and limited knowledge to control unsuspecting Anna, making her fall for his trick. To give you a full context as to the negotiation skills of Anastasia Horshin, she was born in the slums of Kararagi State. She, with her negotiation skills alone, managed to rise from the bottom and become referred to the modern-day reincarnation of the man who founded Kararagi, and becoming the owner of the greatest merchant guild in Nukinika, and one of the royal candidates of Nukinika's throne. Nevertheless, she did not stop Subaru from tricking her during negotiations. Although the negotiations with Kush are plenty impressive, they were just the foundational steps he took and not the entirety of the strategy he had constructed against the witch cult. It was merely a preparation for the upcoming battles they'd face. The battle against White Whale required Subaru to manage the whole army, but prior to that, Subaru had to establish control over the entire expedition, with him giving Kush, appropriately so, the role of the official leader of the expedition due to his poor reputation. But despite this, Subaru was extremely important in the battle itself, by being the one who found out that the White Whale had split off into parts, rather than it suddenly creating two clones of itself with the real one flying high up in the sky, as the other two fought to distract the army to make you believe that you need to kill all three of them, when you really just needed to kill the original White Whale to also kill the other two. Subaru was the first person to conclude this, even before someone as smart as Kush, who was far more intelligent than her age would lead you to suspect, being one of the most intelligent prospects the kingdom had at the time and taking over her far more experienced father at just 17. Moving on to strategy with killing Betelgeuse. He had to manage the resources that were left over after the battle with the White Whale, and strategically assign roles to every individual simultaneously, and him abusing the witch's scent to act as bait for the witch cultists, and subsequently give them orders to kill them one after the other, which minimizes losses on his end. We even see how the witch cultists were following Subaru's orders, being something that Subaru learned throughout his loops, something that was likely a result of his witch's scent that was powerful enough to have the same level of miasma as the Sin Archbishop of Sloth. This led to their belief that Subaru was also a witch cultist, and must have far outranked them considering his miasma. Subaru did die once during his attempt to subjugate Sloth, but it's not really fair to use this as a reason to bring down Subaru, because predicting that Betelgeuse could have taken over his own body was something he had zero methods of predicting, let alone dealing with in that loop. Although Subaru did die, it only became the later catalyst of him achieving an even more perfect ending against Betelgeuse, by creating a more efficient way to tackle the pre-existing problems and successfully using the spies who had infiltrated his own expedition against them, killing Betelgeuse successfully for good this time. This strategy was brilliant enough that even someone like Ram acknowledged Subaru as far more shrewd than she thought he was capable of being, and slightly altered her opinion of him despite her usual demeanor against Subaru. We even see Subaru get the third ranking medal for his achievements against Sloth and the White Whale, only behind Wilhelm and Julius, who were outright the people who killed both of them respectively. Even in the beginning of Arc 4, Subaru immediately had seen through the surface level plan Roswaal had with him, desiring to forcefully restrict Emilia and Subaru to the sanctuary, also deducing that Roswaal had purposefully harmed himself by going into the trials, knowing that he'd be suffering in exchange. Surprising even Roswaal, who despite hearing of his achievements during Arc 3, did not believe that he was that capable during this time. Subaru was also able to deduce that Roswaal was the one who was in control of causing the snow in the sanctuary, rather than Emilia, seeing through his intentions of pinning even more pressure/blame on Emilia, as everyone would naturally connect the snowfall to her, with Roswaal going so far as to claim Subaru had already realized Roswaal was a culprit behind the events in the mansion too, with him only not pursuing it because Subaru's nature made that part hard to accept until Roswaal confessed that it was him. There's a reason why Roswaal, back in Arc 4, believing that without his authority, Subaru's just a normal person who could not possibly be special in any way, could never defeat his perfect game board, without knowing that Subaru had challenged Roswaal with a strategy in mind that would directly use his arrogant belief that Subaru was nothing without his authority against him, to eventually free both the sanctuary as well as to ensure not a single life in the mansion was lost. Even despite having all the odds stacked against him, Subaru managed to find a way to counter the supposed checkmate Subaru was under by using a pawn that was not on the chessboard at all, Oro. By using a piece that was not accounted for in Roswaal's calculation, he was able to influence Roswaal's own chess pieces and use them for his own benefit, overcoming the impossible Roswaal had trapped him inside and successfully winning his straight bet to control what Roswaal could do in the future. Not to mention the person who actually thought of the idea behind how exactly they get rid of the Great Rabbit being Subaru, which was viewed as even harder to defeat than the White Whale. Moving on to Arc 5, something more deserving of credit is the Arc 5 speech Subaru made in Prestella, considering how he was able to completely understand how each and every person was feeling at that moment in time, and think of a speech that was able to give them an immeasurable amount of hope even against the grave amount of despair they were all feeling, to the point its effects were still completely in force even when Garfield was fighting Kurgan several hours later in the shelters, showing us that Subaru can read the mood when it's required of him, as well as exhibit insane levels of charisma by the way he talks. We've also seen Subaru completely read through Anastasia's body being taken over by someone else on first glance itself, with whom nobody else was able to notice at all despite having Subaru spent far less time with her compared to everyone else, and Foxdona having had a long time to mimic her speech pattern and her way of being. Subaru, together with Beatrice's help, was also able to come up with spells like EMM as well as EMT, and a third original spell that is currently unknown that is on the same level as spells that were invented during the era of the witches 400 years ago. Magicians like Roswaal and Echidna came up with that was so powerful that they are specifically termed as different than regular magic altogether, being called a different category of forbidden magic that are spells so powerful that Old Laguna considers them unfair and deletes that spell entirely in the name of maintaining a balance of what should be possible with magic. Prestella herself doesn't even mind Subaru taking on the role of a strategist, which she would have likely done in the case she thought Natsuki Subaru was not capable of the role he was given that was decided by him. Subaru is also far more charismatic than the people given credit for, which is something we see time and time again in the series, as we've seen as Subaru's convinced the people of Island Village to go and cooperate with Emilia, a person they all hated at that point, and later on being charismatic enough to save the people of Prestella, and in Arc 7 being able to convince a group of 600 gladiators to join him in his battle against the Empire, eventually amazing thousands of warriors who all accepted him to be their leader and led them to many victories despite his sparse to non-existent experience with something like this. When you think about it, it is pretty crazy that Subaru was able to somehow make Rem fall so deeply in love with him when you consider their situation before that. Not to mention, Subaru's skill of persuading and using little girls is something not a singular other person could claim to be as good as the Lollimancer. The battle against Regulus with Subaru is once again an extremely good showcase of how sharp Subaru can be when he's not mentally fighting other battles at the same time, with him leading both Emilia and Reinhard at the same time, as deploying the many strategies he thought of in the Light and Weird novel that were unfortunately cut from the anime, that cut on the possibilities upon which Regulus' authority could be functioning upon, with him, of course, eventually connecting that Regulus' authority was related to his own wives and that his authority gave him. And once again, like always, Subaru had a maximum 15 minutes to think of all of this before his battle with Regulus began, as the rest of the time he was busy with the many other things, even managing to waste time with Regulus because he knew that Regulus liked to play with his food. Subaru also generally has a sharp sense of intuition, something which we see again and again, with him being able to guess the singular room Beatrice is located in despite the mansion having nearly 100 doors that could have been chosen. Here in the fight against Regulus, with Subaru also being able to intuitively guess that Regulus' heart was also not beating at all during his fight with Reinhard. Subaru's ability to think quickly in dangerous situations is highlighted once again in the light novel, when he's fighting against a centaur, where he's able to deduce through the very minimal information he had to conclude that he had no ability to see, hear or smell anything, but rather use its ability of echolocation to locate its prey. The narrator himself claimed that Natsuki Subaru had become a hardened veteran when it comes to dealing with threats that could lead to a person's death, and that the idea that he needs to die every time against every opponent would be underestimating Subaru as a whole. During the first trial in the Pleiades Watchtower, we see that Subaru not only just solves a puzzle that was given to them, but also is able to visualize the exact positioning of the monoliths, imagining them as the constellations he was familiar with back from his own planet. Once again, showing that Subaru has really incredible memory and visualization ability by imagining the constellation of Orion amidst the many other constellations he was familiar, basically reconstructing the starry sky he recalled with pinpoint accuracy. Something the anime has sadly cut most of is reference to Subaru's ability to cross-dress as a girl. And I'm not kidding when I say that. Subaru is extremely impressive at this, to the point where Reinhard, with his divine protection that specifically gave him the ability to cross-dress by blessings given to him, is still inferior to Subaru's ability to do so by his own knowledge, being perhaps the only thing Subaru is better than Reinhard at. You'd think there's little to no usage of this, but you'd be wrong, because we've actually seen Subaru implement something like this tactically like you'd never expect otherwise. During Arc 7, Subaru was able to create a strategy that was based on the proposal of creating a bloodless siege with just the ability of a handful of people against a city that was well aware that they would be coming, using his ability to cross-dress as a crux behind this strategy by infiltrating the city as dancers, eventually rising to be popular enough to get a chance to be the same room as Zakir Osman, the person in control of the city, to take control of the city from its heart itself. With this being a completely unpredictable strategy, once again, something Subaru thought of with little time to spare, coming up with a strategy that led to far less losses than the strategy even Vincent would have come up with extremely minimal resource requirements that made use of their bad situations and turning around to a brutal checkmate by using the personality of the wise strategist that was in control of the city, is something extremely brilliant and deserves credit for given the amount of limitations this strategy dealt with in an ingenious way, being impressive enough that even Priscilla gave Subaru a compliment for his ability to scheme. Vincent Volachia, the wisest emperor in the long-lasting centuries-long history as a kingdom, who was considered to be by far the wisest of any and all emperors who had attained the title in the past, considered Subaru as an existence that was alongside only 3 other people in the entire world who could be considered wiser than himself, alongside Priscilla Brielle and Chisha Gold. Although we do have to include the fact that Subaru's intelligence from the perspective of others is obscured, this statement from Vincent being included in that bunch, but we do have a statement from Petra herself, stating that even putting her bias or love for Subaru aside, she viewed him and Otto as equally good at tricking people, as well as being cunning with the very limited amount of resources he's usually forced with. Also viewing him not as inferior to Outlaw, who was the one who orchestrated a lot of events during Arc 5 behind the scenes. The biggest cause of people considering Subaru dumb is that it's unusual to see characters with such horrible circumstances in their situations, which is why some people just straight up don't think that what Subaru is doing is smart with the little things he has. In the eyes of the entire world, Natsuki Subaru is probably the most brilliant strategist in the history of the kingdom, despite there existing no prior record of his existence, with his first major achievement being embarrassing himself at the royal selection, only to go for a generational run with him killing both the great white whale, for which he was awarded in a ceremony, as well as killing the great rabbit, and most importantly, 2 Sin Archbishops of the Witch Cult that were slayed under his hands all within less than 2 years, despite this being a feat of unimaginable difficulty for the last 400 years throughout the entire world. I believe it's only for a reason that Subaru is basically never giving any resources or prep time, because every single time that he's given either of those, he usually has a far easier time against any enemy despite their own preparations or strength. While I'll leave the conclusion of whether Subaru is a genius or not in your eyes, I do at least confidently think that Subaru's most definitely not a stupid character, but at least someone who's far more intelligent than the average person, especially so for someone who's been a hikomori during his education and suffered through a lot of problems. It seems like the title of child prodigy that was given to Subaru might not have been a good label to apply to him in terms of school. It seems like the meaning behind that title might remain true in another situation. With that in mind, I'll leave it to you whether Subaru is a genius or an idiot.